You look like hell, man.
Long week. Doyle's the easiest guy to pin it on.
Yeah, he's not gonna fight it.
Doyle's the easiest guy to pin it on. They're planning revenge on you next.
Why are you telling me this? If anyone would let me explain.
You're suspended, pending the investigation.
I was covering a shift. For Danny.
I moved too fast. I'm sorry, Marcus.
What happens to him now?
We're rectifying the situation now.
I know why you did it.
Doesn't make it right. No.
It doesn't. You gonna make this harder for me than it already is?
No, I'm not gonna make it harder.
Are we gonna be okay?
We're gonna be okay.
Marcus Doyle had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether his life was about to fall apart. He was standing in a glass-walled office under fluorescent light that made everything look a shade too honest, staring at a manila folder someone had already opened for him. Inside it, a printed still from a security camera, a timestamp, and his own face, caught mid-shift, standing exactly where he shouldn't have been standing on a night he swore he could explain, if anyone would let him. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a waitress who had never met this man before in her life decided she couldn't stay quiet about what she overheard in a diner booth 2 tables away from her own life falling apart. And you'll understand why the version of Marcus Doyle who walked into that office that morning was not the same man who walked out of it 3 weeks later. But to understand how he got there, we have to go back 2 weeks. To an ordinary Tuesday. Before any of this had a name yet. Marcus Doyle had built his life around not being noticed. Not in a sad way, not exactly. More like a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the safest place to stand was slightly out of the light. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered from a decade on warehouse floors, with a scar along his left forearm from an accident nobody remembered but him. He wore the same gray company polo most days, the same steel-toed boots, the same flat, even voice that rarely rose above a conversational register even when the moment called for more. On weekday mornings, his routine had the rhythm of a man who had refined it out of necessity, not preference. Up at 5:30. Lunch packed for Eli, his 9-year-old son, sandy-haired, gap-toothed, prone to wearing mismatched socks on purpose because he'd decided at 7 that matching was boring. Drop off at Aunt Carol's on the way to the distribution center, a quick hug, be good, and then 10 hours of forklifts and inventory sheets under buzzing warehouse light. It wasn't a hard life to understand. It was, if you looked at it plainly, the life of a single dad, the kind of quiet, unglamorous devotion that never shows up in a highlight reel, that just shows up every day, on time, without asking for credit. He checked his watch, an old black digital one, scratched at the face, the band worn soft. It had belonged to his late wife's father. He didn't wear it because it kept good time. He wore it because some mornings, checking it felt like checking in with someone. That Tuesday started like any other. He clocked in at 6. He nodded at Ray Petrosky on his way to the loading bay, a heavy-set man in his mid-40s who'd worked inventory almost as long as Marcus had worked the dock, and who'd always been decent enough, if a little more tired-looking than usual lately. Neither of them had any idea that in 11 days, one of them would be the reason the other one's life came apart at the seams. The two of them had worked within 20 feet of each other for 6 years. Marcus didn't know much about Ray's life outside the warehouse, a sister somewhere out of state, a fondness for the same brand of instant coffee everyone on the dock complained about, a habit of staying 20 minutes past the end of his shift most nights, tallying inventory sheets long after the forklifts had gone quiet. Marcus had always figured that was just Ray being thorough. It never once occurred to him it might be something else, a man trying to buy himself a little more time before he had to go home and face whatever was waiting for him there. "You look like hell, man," Marcus told him that morning, not unkindly, passing him near the loading bay doors. Ray managed something like a smile. Long week. Every week's a long week around here. Yeah, Ray said, and something in his voice caught, just slightly, in a way Marcus would only recognize much later as the sound of a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd already made. Guess it is. Marcus clocked the moment and let it go, the way you let go of 100 small oddities in other people's lives every week, because you have your own life to run and your own kid to raise, and there's only so much attention a person has to spend on someone else's bad morning. That was the thing about Marcus's world, it ran on 1,000 small kindnesses nobody kept score of. Covering a shift for a coworker's kid's recital. Letting a tired man's odd mood slide without comment. Trusting, without needing it written down, that the people around him were operating in good faith, the same way he tried to. It was a good way to live, most days. It was also, as it turned out, exactly the kind of trust a desperate man could quietly take advantage of without ever meaning to become the villain of someone else's story. 3 miles away, in a diner with red vinyl booths and a bell that jingled every time the door opened, a 27-year-old waitress named Denise Cho was refilling a coffee pot and trying very hard not to listen to the conversation happening 2 booths behind her. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. That was the thing she'd tell herself later, over and over, like it mattered, like intent could undo what she now knew. She'd just been wiping down the counter near the back booth when she heard her boyfriend's name mentioned, and then Ray's name, and then a sentence that made her stop moving entirely. Footage doesn't lie, man. Long as it's time-stamped right, nobody's gonna ask why he was even back there. Doyle's the easiest guy to pin it on, the guy barely talks, he's not gonna fight it. Denise didn't know who Doyle was. Not yet. But she knew what she just heard sounded like a plan. And she knew, with the sinking certainty of someone who'd spent her whole life avoiding conflict, that she was now the only person outside that booth who knew it existed. She finished her shift. She went home. She didn't sleep well. For 3 days after that, Denise told herself it wasn't her business. She'd repeat it to herself at red lights, in the shower, while restocking napkin dispensers between the lunch and dinner rush, not your business, not your business, not your business, like a woman trying to talk herself out of a decision her conscience had already made without her permission. Twice, she almost said something to her boyfriend directly. Both times, she stopped herself before the words left her mouth, picturing exactly how that conversation would go, the deflection, the defensiveness, the inevitable why were you even listening, and she knew, with a clarity that scared her a little, that saying anything to him would accomplish nothing except putting a target on her own back before she'd even figured out what to do with what she knew. So she waited. And the waiting was its own kind of quiet suffering, the particular ache of carrying a truth that belongs, in some sense, to someone who doesn't even know it exists yet. By the time Marcus found out he was under investigation, it was already Thursday of the following week, and the ground had shifted without him feeling it move. He was called into HR without warning, no context, no explanation, just a clipped message from his supervisor to see Patricia win before his shift. Patricia was the kind of HR director who believed, with real conviction, that process protected everyone, including the wrongly accused, as long as it was followed correctly. She wasn't cruel. She was careful. But careful, when the evidence in front of you looks clean, can look a lot like certainty. There's been a discrepancy in inventory, she told him, sliding the folder half an inch closer across the desk. Recurring losses over the last 6 weeks. And there's footage placing you near the affected shelving on a night you weren't scheduled. Marcus looked at the still image. Grainy black and white, himself in the frame, exactly where the timestamp said he shouldn't have been. I was covering a shift, he said. For Danny. He had his kid's thing, I don't even remember what, a recital or something. I stayed late to close out his section. Is there a record of that? He thought about it. And realized, with a small, cold drop in his stomach, that there wasn't. It had been a favor. A handshake. The kind of quiet decency that never gets written down because the people doing it never think they'll need proof of their own character. No, he said. There isn't. Patricia's face didn't change, but something in the room did. You're suspended, pending the investigation. With pay, for now. I'm sorry, Marcus. He nodded. He didn't argue. That wasn't who he was, and by the time he was back in his truck in the parking lot, hands on the wheel, engine not yet started, the full weight of that fact, that he simply wasn't a man who fought for himself, landed on him for maybe the first time in his adult life as something other than a virtue. If you've ever had to explain to a 9-year-old why the routine is changing without telling him the real reason, you already know how that evening went. Eli noticed. Of course he noticed, kids like Eli always do, long before you say a word. He found his dad on the phone with Aunt Carol that night, voice low, arranging extra pickup days, just for a bit, and when Marcus hung up, Eli was standing in the kitchen doorway in his striped hoodie, one sock covered in cartoon rockets, the other plain white. Are we gonna be okay? He asked. Not dramatic. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from a kid who has learned, in ways no 9-year-old should have to, what it sounds like when adults are worried. Marcus knelt down. We're gonna be okay, he said, and meant it, even though at that exact moment he had no earthly idea how. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, doing the kind of math no one wants to do at 11 at night. Savings that would cover maybe 6 weeks if the suspension turned into something worse. A truck payment due on the 15th. A mental list of odd jobs he could pick up on weekends if it came to that, hauling, yard work, anything that didn't ask too many questions of a man currently under investigation at his real job. He thought about calling Aunt Carol and telling her the truth of it, the whole truth, instead of the softened version he'd given her over the phone. He picked up his phone twice and put it down twice. In the end, he didn't call. He just sat there a while longer, watching the numbers not add up, and then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed without solving anything, because some nights, that's simply as far as a person can get. If stories like this one, about the quiet weight some people carry, and the courage it takes for someone else to notice it, are the kind of thing that moves you, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what happens next is going to complicate everything you think you understand about who the villain in this story actually is. Denise had been carrying the weight of what she'd overheard for almost 2 weeks now, and it hadn't gotten lighter. If anything, it had gotten heavier every day she didn't act on it, every shift where she refilled coffee and wiped counters and told herself it wasn't her business, that getting involved would blow up things in her own life she wasn't ready to deal with yet. She hadn't told anyone that she was already planning to leave her boyfriend. That decision had nothing to do with any of this, it had been coming for months, quietly, the way these decisions do, but it made everything about this situation more complicated, because going to a stranger with information that could expose her boyfriend's friend meant risking that unraveling faster and messier than she wanted. But then, on a slow Tuesday afternoon, a man walked into the diner alone, sat in the corner booth, and ordered coffee he barely touched. Denise recognized him, not personally, but she'd heard his name by now. Doyle. The guy from Ray's plan. The one Ray's friend had said was the easiest guy to pin it on. She watched him from across the room. He didn't look like a man plotting anything. He looked like a man who'd had something taken from him and hadn't figured out how to get it back. She poured a second cup of coffee she hadn't been asked for, walked over, and set it down in front of him. "You're Marcus, right?" she said. "Doyle." He looked up, surprised. "Yeah." She glanced toward the kitchen, toward the door, toward anywhere but his face. "I need you to hear something, and I need you to not ask me how I know it yet. Can you do that?" He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he already suspects the ground is about to move again. "They're planning revenge on you next," she said, quieter now, leaning in. Not revenge like violence. I don't mean that. I mean, someone set you up. On purpose. For something you didn't do. And I think it's still happening. For a long moment, Marcus just looked at her. Not with suspicion. With something closer to exhaustion meeting the first real thread of hope he'd had in 11 days. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Denise's hands were shaking slightly around the coffee pot. "Because I know what it looks like to watch something happen and say nothing," she said. "And I don't want to be that person anymore." Here's where it gets complicated. Because the story Denise told Marcus over the next few minutes, fragmented, careful, protective of names she wasn't ready to give up yet, pointed toward Ray Petrosky. A man Marcus had worked beside for years. A man who'd never given him a single reason to expect this. Marcus didn't confront him right away. That wasn't his instinct, and it wasn't his nature. Instead, he did something quieter, and in its own way, harder. He started paying attention. To schedules. To who had access to the shelving in question. To the kind of small inconsistencies a careful man notices when he finally has a reason to look. What he found didn't fit the story he expected. Ray wasn't living large off stolen inventory. Ray was drowning. His sister had been in and out of the hospital for the better part of a year, and the debt from it had piled up in a way that a warehouse inventory coordinator's salary was never going to outrun. He hadn't sold product out of greed. He'd sold it out of panic, a slow, compounding, middle-of-the-night kind of panic that eventually convinces a decent man that a bad decision is the only decision left. And when the discrepancies started drawing attention, Ray hadn't confessed. He'd done what desperate, cornered people sometimes do. He'd looked for the quietest person nearby, the one least likely to fight back, and let the blame drift toward him instead. It should have made Marcus angrier than it did. He sat with that for a long time, turning it over. And what surprised him most wasn't Ray's guilt. It was his own reaction to it, the flicker of understanding that came before the anger ever fully arrived. He went to see Danny, the coworker whose shift he'd covered the night the footage was taken, and asked him to write down, in his own words, exactly what had happened that evening, the recital, the favor, the handshake agreement neither of them had thought to document. Danny didn't hesitate. He wrote it out on the spot, signed it, and asked Marcus why he needed it, and Marcus, not wanting to drag anyone else into something still half-formed, only said, "Just covering my bases." It wasn't the whole truth. But it wasn't a lie either, it was the version of the truth Marcus could afford to give away at that particular moment, and he was learning, slowly, that sometimes that had to be enough. He didn't go to Denise again. He didn't need to, not yet. What she'd given him was a direction, not a case, and he understood without her having to say it twice that pushing her for more before she was ready would cost her more than it would gain him. So he waited, the way she had waited, carrying his own version of the same quiet weight, and let the pieces come together at whatever pace they were going to come together. The investigation reopened on a gray Thursday morning, back in the same glass-walled office, under the same too honest light. This time, Denise was there. She'd finally gone to Patricia Wynne directly, laying out what she'd overheard, along with something she hadn't expected to still have, a backed-up text thread from her boyfriend's phone that had synced to a shared cloud account months earlier and never been deleted. It wasn't proof of everything. But paired with the corrected timestamp on the original security footage, which, once properly reviewed, showed Marcus arriving for his covered shift a full 90 minutes after the inventory in question had already gone missing, it was enough. Patricia sat with the folder open in front of her, the same folder, its contents rearranged now into a very different story than the one it had told 2 weeks earlier. "I moved too fast," she admitted, and to her credit, she didn't dress it up. "I'm sorry, Marcus." Marcus didn't gloat. It wasn't in him, and even if it had been, it wasn't what he wanted from this moment. He simply nodded and asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since he'd learned the truth about Ray. "What happens to him now?" "He'll be let go," Patricia said. "Given what he did, that's not really in question." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I talk to him before he leaves?" Patricia hesitated, glancing at the folder as though it might offer an answer she didn't already know. "That's not usually how this goes," she said. Then, after a moment, but I'll allow it. 5 minutes. Denise had stayed in the hallway outside, not wanting to be in the room for what came next. As Marcus passed her on his way out, she caught his sleeve, briefly. You okay? I don't know yet, he admitted. Ask me in 5 minutes. The conversation between Marcus and Ray lasted less than 2 minutes, and neither man raised his voice. Ray wouldn't look at him at first, sat there in the break room with his company jacket still zipped up like he might need to leave in a hurry, the same jacket he wore even indoors, tired eyes fixed on the table between them. I know why you did it, Marcus said. Not a question. Not an accusation dressed up as one, either. Just a fact, laid down plainly. Ray's jaw tightened. Doesn't make it right. No, Marcus agreed. It doesn't. There was a long silence. Ray finally looked up. You gonna make this harder for me than it already is? Marcus thought about Eli, asking if they were going to be okay. He thought about 11 days of not knowing if he was about to lose the one job holding his and his son's life together. He thought about how easy it would have been for Ray to just tell the truth from the start, and how much simpler this all could have been. And then he thought about a debt tied to a sister's hospital bills, and a man who'd made one desperate decision at the bottom of a very long fall. No, Marcus said finally. I'm not going to make it harder. He didn't offer forgiveness like it was a gift being handed down from someone above the situation. He offered it like a man who understood, better than most, what it costs to be cornered, and who had just spent 2 weeks learning exactly how much it means when someone chooses not to make that cornering worse. Before he left the room, he told Ray he'd write him a neutral reference letter, if he needed one. Not because Ray had earned it in some tidy, movie-ending way. Just because Marcus had decided, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that the kind of man he wanted to be wasn't defined by what someone else had tried to take from him. Ray didn't thank him. Not out loud, not in words, some debts sit too heavy for that. But as Marcus turned to leave, Ray said one more thing to his back, quiet enough that it almost didn't carry. For what it's worth, I never wanted it to be you specifically. You were just, there. Easy. I told myself that made it smaller, somehow. It didn't. Marcus paused at the door but didn't turn around. I know, he said. And then he left, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying, and because some conversations are better ended a sentence too early than a sentence too late. Marcus was reinstated the following Monday, back pay included, his file cleared without asterisk or footnote. He went back to the loading dock like nothing had happened, because that was who he was, the kind of man who absorbs a disruption and keeps the routine running, even when the routine had nearly buckled underneath him. But something had shifted, quietly, in the 2 weeks it had taken for the truth to catch up to the lie. Aunt Carol hugged him a beat longer than usual when he came to pick up Eli that Monday, and didn't ask him to explain why. Eli, for his part, wanted to know if he could tell his class about it for show and tell, and Marcus told him maybe they'd save that one for a story he could tell when he was a little older. Some things, he said, are worth waiting to understand fully before you hand them to someone else. He saw Denise once more before the season turned, a brief, unplanned run-in at the grocery store, nothing dramatic, no soundtrack swelling behind it. Just two people who'd been strangers a month earlier, now bound by something neither of them had asked for. Thank you, he told her. For saying something. She shrugged, a little uncomfortable with the weight of it. I almost didn't. I know, Marcus said. That's kind of the point. That night, Marcus sat across from Eli at their small kitchen table, the same mismatched chairs, the same corkboard behind them covered in crayon drawings and school notices, one of them a picture Eli had made months ago, carefully labeled in blocky 9-year-old handwriting, me and Dad. Eli was doing homework, sock feet swinging under his chair, one sock covered in rockets, the other plain white, because matching, apparently, was still boring. Everything's fixed now? Eli asked, not looking up from his worksheet. Yeah, Marcus said. Everything's fixed. Eli nodded like that settled it, the way kids do when they've decided to trust the person who's never once let them down. Marcus watched him for a moment, the ordinary, unremarkable scene of a boy doing math homework at a kitchen table on a Tuesday night, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 2 weeks straight. "Hey, bud," Marcus said. "Can I tell you something?" Eli looked up. "Sometimes the right thing finds you a helper," Marcus said. "You just gotta let them help. Even when it's easier to just handle it yourself." Eli considered this with the particular seriousness only a 9-year-old can bring to a sentence he doesn't fully understand yet. "Like the waitress lady?" Marcus smiled, small and real. "Yeah, bud. Like the waitress lady." There's a version of this story that ends with Marcus Doyle standing over Ray Petrosky, watching him lose everything, feeling the clean, sharp satisfaction of a wrong finally righted. That version exists. Plenty of people would tell you it's the more satisfying one. But that's not the story that actually happened. What happened instead was quieter, and harder, and maybe more honest. A man who had spent his whole adult life staying invisible finally had to be seen, had to let someone else's courage carry part of a weight he'd always insisted on carrying alone. And when the moment came to decide what kind of man he wanted to be on the other side of it, he chose something more complicated than revenge, and more difficult to sustain than anger. He chose to understand. And then he chose mercy anyway. None of it undid the 11 days he spent not knowing if he'd have a job by month's end. None of it erased the sound of his son asking if they were going to be okay. But it changed, permanently, the shape of the man who walked away from it, a single dad who had always measured his own worth by how little help he needed, learning instead that the people who stay standing longest are rarely the ones who carry everything alone. They're the ones who let someone else help carry it, just long enough to catch their footing again. So here's the question worth sitting with, long after this story ends: is staying quiet, enduring, absorbing, never asking for help, really the strength we so often mistake it for? Or is real strength something closer to what Denise did in that diner, and what Marcus did in that break room, the courage to say something, and the courage, once the truth comes out, to still choose grace? Thank you for watching this story all the way through. If it moved you, or if you've ever been the one who stayed quiet, or the one who finally didn't, we'd love to hear your take in the comments below. And if stories like this one, about ordinary people facing extraordinary moral tests, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe and stay close. There are more stories like this one coming.